Well, hello and welcome to our Christ Baptist Church devotional where we're going through the book of Nehemiah. We've gone through Nehemiah chapter 1 through 10 and we're almost toward the end. We're going to cover chapters 11 and 12, two big chapters today because there's just a small thing to glean out of these chapters. They're big lists of names. But we've gone through Nehemiah 1 through 10, which is at the time of the reign of Artaxerxes the first. And we begin with his 20th year of his reign, which is 444 BC, he started about 464 BC. And so we're starting in his 20th year of his reign when he finds out that Jerusalem is broken down, the walls are destroyed, the gates are burned, and he's just so distraught. He gets permission from the king to go visit, which he does. And he goes and he visits and he gets the walls rebuilt in 52 days. Just in how he organized, we saw his leadership skills, we saw what God did in protecting him from the enemies without, the enemies within, and how to keep social order and keep people following the Lord. All that was such a difficult task, and he did it with just such strong leadership skills. And then we saw the nation turn to repentance in Nehemiah chapter 8. And then make a covenant in 9 and 10. They signed a document, and in chapter 10, they had a big confession where they understood that they really had not been following the ways of God. And so now, for the second time, because Ezra went about 13 years earlier to reform the nation, which he did, but the nation started to go back down again. Now here comes Nehemiah, the new governor, and he gets things started up. And so with that, over time, we're not saying this is exactly in the same time frame as Nehemiah chapter 8 and 9, and 8, 9, and 10. Not exactly in the same time frame when they all repented and were confessing. But now what's happened is there's a situation over some time. They're realizing that there's not many people in Jerusalem and they need to do something about it. We've got a big city with walls and gates. They got to be able to man those gates and figure this out. So here we are in Nehemiah chapter 11, and we'll read verses 1, 2, and 3 here. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while non-tents remained in the other cities. You see, almost all the people were living in their hometowns and their cities, and only the leaders lived in Jerusalem, because that's where they're from. And they needed to have more people, so they cast lots. They tried to get God's direction to figure out one out of every 10 people in every city would go and live in Jerusalem. So they have to leave where they're at, their comfort zone, their farms, all that, and go and try to make a living in Jerusalem. And verse 2 says that the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem, because it really was a volunteer job to leave your comfort, your family, and all what you know, and to go be in the city in Jerusalem, from rural life to urban life. But it was 1 out of 10, so he could help populate the city. Verse 3, now these are the heads of the provinces who lived in Jerusalem, but in the cities of Judah, each lived in his own property, their cities, the Israelites, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, the descendants of Solomon's servants. So these are the heads of the various provinces who lived in Jerusalem, and so we get a list. We've seen a lot of lists in Nehemiah and in Ezra. And here's a list of all the heads of the families. Many of them are new names from what we've had. Some are going to be old. And it's primarily sons of Judah, verse 4. Verse 6, sons of Perez, who was a particular tribe in Judah. It tells us that there were 468 of those able men. And we start getting numbers of people who are now living in Jerusalem. And we say it's only really a couple thousand people maximum that were added in a big city like Jerusalem. And they were added in there to go ahead and live in Jerusalem. So from verses 3 all the way down to verse 19, we see a list of all the family members, the Levites, the people who stayed in Jerusalem or moved to Jerusalem. Then we see verse 20, the rest of Israel, of the priests and of the Levites, were in all the cities of Judah, each on his own inheritance. So the rest of Israel was not in the city, and they were on their own inheritance. So they were getting settled in the land where they lived. But there were more temple servants, verse 21, living in a place called Ophel, and there were people in charge of the temple servants. And now we see more people still talking about how they had to be organized. Verse 23 tells us there was a commandment from the king. That would be not King David or King of Israel, but the king of Persia, concerning them, and a firm regulation for the song leaders day by day. So the king of Persia actually had a regulation for how all the temple work was going to get done and the singing and all that, because God put it in his heart to go support Israel. If we remember the history, when we read not just Nehemiah, but Ezra and Esther and all of that, God had favor on Israel, even all the way back to Cyrus, because that's really what it boils down to. The reason Artaxerxes allowed Nehemiah to go back was because he'd also gotten a hold of a letter that said, yeah, you're right, Cyrus told us that we should have these people go back, so let's go do that. So they had these occasions where God was putting in the heart of the Persian kings to have favor on Israel. So much so that they told everybody, you better let Israel follow the religious orders of their religion to worship their God. And as a matter of fact, I'm so moved by it, I want everybody else to follow Israel's God. So Cyrus did that, so did Xerxes, so did Artaxerxes. So there was a commandment, so they were getting themselves organized. And now verses 20 on down to the end of the chapter is talking about what was going on in the cities and how they were getting organized in the cities. And verse 25, now as for the villages with their fields, some of the sons of Judah lived in Kiriath Arba and its towns, in Dibon and its towns, and in Jekabzeel and its villages, and lists a bunch more. These are the people living in the villages outside. Verse 31 talks about the sons of Benjamin living in their towns. And it goes on and explains and lists those towns where they were living. Gets to the end of chapter 11. Takes us to chapter 12. The list continues. Chapter 12. Now these are the priests and the Levites who came up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua. This is an old list. This is saying the ones who actually came up, the original people from Cyrus's first decree. Ezra chapter 1 verse 1. These are the priests and the Levites. Not all the people, just the priests and the Levites who came. And we see them and see their list right here. A lot of them are the same. And then we see them continued, registered in the days, verse 22, registered in the days of Eliashib, Joiada and Johanan and Jaddua. So were the priests in the reign of Darius the Persian. So this covers the span of all of the Persian kings, even the ones that are after this time. So it goes back to the very first, Jeshua, as well as all the way down to Nehemiah, which is Eliashib, and then you get further ones, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua. Those came after Nehemiah. And so all these Levites who were part of this family, who they're registered in these days, they came. Sons of Levi, they showed up. Heads of the Levites, and lists who they were. And it continues to show that here's all the people that were getting organized in them. Verse 26 tells us, they served in the days of Joachim, the son of Jeshua, the son of Josedek, and in the days of Nehemiah, the governor, and Ezra, the priest and scribe. So these guys, Jeshua and Josedek, were way back when they built the temple in 520. 520 BC. Actually, like Ezra chapters 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Jeshua was the high priest. And also in the days of Nehemiah the governor, that was Eliashib. So a whole different high priest came during his time. And of Ezra the priest and scribe. So these are all the people during that time. During the time when they built the temple, even just before they built the temple, all the way now to the times of Ezra and Nehemiah. These are all the priests that have been registered. Now, verse 27 tells us, At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites from all their places to bring them to Jerusalem so that they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, with hymns of thanksgiving, with songs and the accompaniment of cymbals, harps, and lyres. So the sons of the singers were assembled from the district around Jerusalem, and from the villages of the Netophathites, from Beth Gilgal, and from their fields in Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had built themselves villages around Jerusalem. The priests and the Levites purified themselves. They also purified the people, the gates, and the wall. So, what we see is now, in dedicating the wall, they wanted to have a time of celebration. And this is something that we need to understand, is that God calls us to celebrate as much as he calls us to serve. He calls us to celebrate just as much as he calls us to serve. And so they were getting around to celebrate, specifically singing. What we see in verse 31, he had the leaders of Judah come up on top of the wall and appointed 2 great choirs. So in part of celebration, he gets the choirs organized. Gets that all working. And gets the people all lined up. And that's describing how the choirs are now on top of the wall, all around, and all the people. And so this is organizing the choirs to stand on the wall to celebrate. And we can say, beginning in verse 44, this is really our application here, verse 44. On that day, men were also appointed over the chambers for the stores, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather into them from the fields into the cities, the portions required by law for the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who served. So they're really thankful of all the people who helped them serve, the priests and Levites, and they got choirs. And I want to emphasize singing here in worship and celebration. Verse 45, for they performed the worship of their God and the service of purification, together with the singers and the gatekeepers, in accordance with the command of David and of his son Solomon. For the days of David and Asaph, at ancient times, there were leaders of the singers, songs of praise and hymns of thanksgiving to God. So all Israel, in the days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, gave the portions due the singers and the gatekeepers as each day required, and set apart the consecrated portion for the Levites, and the Levites set apart the consecrated portion for the sons of Aaron. So this is chapter 11 and 12. Lots of lists of people. Basically, they're saying there's not enough people living in Jerusalem, so we've got to select 1 out of 10 out of the rural areas and have them live in the cities. Big sacrifice for the people. They're so confident in the wall that they consecrated it, and they had a celebration service. And the celebration service, they put people on top of the walls, but what they really put up there was choirs. And if we were to look back at Chronicles, we see David appointing singers and gatekeepers and people who kept the whole musical aspect of worship in order. This is a very important thing to God. And this is how they worship, this is how they actually celebrate it. And I want to have this be our application here, is that music is very, very important to God. He made us so that we could actually not just sing like birds or like whales in the ocean, but that we sing with order and we actually compose. He provides a giftedness so that there are people who can compose music. It's all got a mathematical order. We're the only beings on the earth that understand that. We understand that a man named Handel, he wrote over the course of about 3 weeks a whole musical that we call the Messiah. And he just wrote it just overnight, just composed this thing from scratch. We sing it now every Easter, the Hallelujah chorus. All came from somebody saying, I want to worship God and explain it. He wrote all the parts for all the instruments in the symphony. Nobody else could do that. He did that to the glory of God. See, worship, singing is very important to God. It's a very important part of our worship service that we have. It was a very important part of how Israel celebrated, so much so that Nehemiah recorded it. Of all the things he could have recorded, he recorded this. So that we understand singing is very important to God. And so while we're under this lockdown situation, we're having to watch under video, we're not able to come down. The government tells us that we cannot sing. We have to wear masks, we can't sing. Well, we're not meeting at this time, so you know what we can do? We can sing in our homes. When we have songs up, I really want to encourage you. Take a note from Nehemiah. This is when you sing as a family. This is when you sing where you're together and you just lift up your voices and you sing. You don't just listen. You sing because this is to God. God is here. God is every Sunday with us. It's not just a video. God is with us. And you can sing to your God as Nehemiah had the choirs set to do this. You see, when we aren't singing, we're withholding. We're saying, God, I don't want to give this to you. I don't want you to hear this. I don't want you to acknowledge this. We're saying that. So when we get a chance and we see songs of praise to God, we join in. We join in and jump in and say what we can. And I know many of us are embarrassed by how we sing and we're not that good, but that's not the point, is it? The point is we need to unite and do as Nehemiah organized here to give praise to God. Singing is very important to God. That's what we learned today in Nehemiah chapters 11 and 12. After we say all the people went to Jerusalem, this is how they consecrated. This is how they celebrated. So we celebrate as much as we serve. Christianity is a joyful religion. We celebrate as much as we serve. And we do it by singing. So I want to be able to, in my mind, hear you singing with us on Sunday morning. We'll see you tomorrow on Nehemiah chapter 13.